This is too big. Rancher froze when he saw the giant bride bathing at the lake. A man who swore never to love again meets a stranger in his own lake, towering, scarred, and unwanted by the world. She expects him to laugh, to jeer, to walk away like all the others. But instead, he offers her his coat. They called her a mistake. They called him a fool. But behind the whispers was a truth only they knew. Love doesn't measure inches, it measures courage. The creek ran silver in the fading light, the water restless as evening winds stirred through the cottonwoods. Fletcher Ward guided his horse down the bank, thinking only of the thirst in his throat and the silence he carried like a second skin. It had been years since laughter warmed his house, years since a voice softer than his own had lived beneath his roof. He had buried love in a pine box beside a willow, and he had sworn he would never risk opening that wound again. But the West has a way of testing promises. He heard the splash before he saw her. At first, he thought it might be a deer, or perhaps a cow strayed too far from its herd. He reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes toward the shimmer of the creek. And then he froze. A figure rose from the water, tall enough to blot out the horizon behind her. The light of the setting sun clung to her wet skin, turning her into something more than flesh, something carved out of legend, half spirit, half storm. His breath caught, his throat tight. She turned, startled by the sound of hooves on stone. For a brief moment, she looked like she might flee, though there was nowhere to go. Her eyes locked with his, dark, wounded, yet burning with something fierce beneath the surface. Her shoulders were broad, her stance defiant, but he could see the tremor she tried to hide. The words slipped from his lips before he could stop them. This is too big. Her chin lifted, and he saw it then. The shield she had built, the readiness for mockery, the bitter expectation that he would laugh like all the others. She had heard those words before, but never as he meant them now. To her, they were knives. To him, they were all. She didn't answer. She simply stood there, water dripping from her frame, daring him to speak again. Fletcher swung his leg over his horse, boots thudding onto the damp earth. His hands, rough from years of rope and hammer, fumbled with the coat strapped to his saddle. He stepped forward, the ground sucking at his heels, and held it out. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough, uncertain. "You'll catch your death in there. Take this." Her eyes widened, as if the gesture itself was a trick. For a long second she didn't move, and he thought maybe she'd refuse out of pride. But then, slowly, her hand reached for the coat. Their fingers brushed, and he felt it. A spark, sharp and startling, racing up his arm into his chest. He pulled back quickly, unsettled. She clutched the coat close, wrapping it around herself with a kind of reverence. Her lips parted, voice low and raw. "You're not laughing." Fletcher met her gaze, steady. "Ain't nothing funny here." Her throat tightened, and for the first time, he saw the wall around her crack. A flicker of something soft, hope, maybe, or disbelief, crossed her face before she swallowed it back. She stepped out of the water, dripping, the coat dragging heavy around her shoulders. She stood taller than him by inches, her shadow spilling long across the bank. He thought again of the whispers he'd heard in town weeks ago. A mail-order bride meant for a rancher in the next county. A woman too large, too awkward, left behind like freight no man wanted. They had laughed about her at the saloon, saying she disappeared as quickly as she'd arrived. But she hadn't vanished. She was here, standing on his land, trembling though she hid it well. "You lost?" he asked. Her voice carried the edge of a blade dulled by sorrow. "Aren't I always?" The words struck him harder than he expected. He knew loss, too. He lived with it every sunrise, every empty supper table. He shifted, torn between leaving her and stepping closer. Common sense told him to ride on. But something deeper, something older, rooted him in place. "You got a name?" "Eliza." She said it quickly, like a secret she regretted sharing. "Fletcher Ward." He tipped his hat. "My ranch is up the ridge." Her eyes narrowed. "Why tell me that?" He hesitated, searching for an answer. "So you know there's a roof not far from here. If you've a mind to stay warm." She gave a humorless laugh. "Why? So the town can laugh at you too? So they can call you a fool for helping the giant woman no man wants." The fire in her voice was sharp, but he heard the pain underneath. He thought of the gossip, of the way people in small towns tore apart anything they didn't understand. He imagined the whispers if they saw her with him. Maybe she was right. Maybe they would call him a fool. He stepped closer anyway, his boots sinking deeper in the mud. Let them laugh. They don't live my life. You can stay the night. Just the night. She studied him long, eyes flicking over his face as if testing for deceit. Finally, she nodded, slow and reluctant. One night, he helped her onto his horse, the animal shifting under her weight, but he steadied it with a firm hand on the reins. He mounted behind her, careful to keep distance, though the warmth of her pressed against him all the same. They rode in silence, the sound of hooves mixing with the rising song of crickets. The night closed in around them, stars pricking the dark like holes torn in the sky. By the time the ranch house came into view, the firelight glowing faint through the window, Fletcher felt the weight of something pressing heavy on his chest. He told himself it was only for tonight. A stranger in need. Nothing more. But the whisper of her voice lingered, and the spark from her touch still burned in his hand. Inside, the fire was low. He lit a lamp, shadows dancing across the walls. She stood just inside the doorway, dripping onto the floor, holding his coat tight. He motioned toward the chair near the hearth. Sit. She lowered herself slowly, the chair groaning under her frame. She stretched her hands toward the fire, eyes closing as warmth kissed her skin. For the first time, she looked less like a mountain defying storms and more like a woman simply tired. Fletcher poured coffee from the pot on the stove, set a cup on the table before her. She stared at it, then at him. You don't even know me. He leaned against the mantel, arms folded. Don't need to. Cold is cold. Hunger's hunger. That's enough. Her lips trembled, though she pressed them together. She lifted the cup with both hands, sipping slow. Steam curled around her face, softening the edges of her defiance. Fletcher turned his gaze to the flames, the crackle filling the silence between them. He told himself again it was just one night. But deep down, he knew it already. Nothing about this night would leave him unchanged. The wind rattled the shutters, whistling through the gaps in the wood. Fletcher shoved another log into the fire, sparks snapping up the chimney. The glow spread across the room, warming the rough walls, glinting off the iron pot and tin plates stacked on the counter. He wasn't used to company. His house, like his heart, had grown accustomed to silence. Now the silence felt different, charged, as though it held its breath. Eliza sat in the chair, clutching the cup between her hands, eyes fixed on the fire. Steam curled past her cheeks, but her gaze seemed far away. Fletcher leaned against the mantel, watching her without meaning to, wondering what kind of road had carved such weariness into her shoulders. She broke the quiet first. You think you're doing me a kindness. Her voice was steady, but softer than before, as if the warmth had melted part of her armor. But men don't keep kindness. Not for long. Fletcher shifted his jaw. Not all men. She gave a small, bitter laugh. All the ones I've met. She set the cup down, fingers tapping the wood. They see me, they see a joke. A giant. A burden no man would claim. Even the one who sent for me. When I stepped off that coach, he turned his back like I was spoiled goods. Her words cut sharper than she intended, the edges trembling with hurt she couldn't hide. Fletcher stared at her, the fire painting lines across his weathered face. He thought of the men at the saloon, the way they had snickered into their mugs, the cruel delight in their voices. He had said nothing then, keeping his head down as always. But now, with her in his chair, her scars laid bare, he wished he had stood up. You're not a joke, he said simply. She blinked, as if the plainness of it startled her more than flowery words would have. You don't even know me. I don't need to, Fletcher replied. I know enough. Her eyes lingered on him, searching, but she said no more. Instead, she drew the coat tighter, sinking deeper into the chair. The firelight made her look softer, less like the mountain he had first seen in the creek, more like a woman worn thin by too many storms. Fletcher moved toward the shelf, pulling down a wool blanket. He laid it gently over the back of her chair. You can take the bed. Her head jerked up. No. He raised a brow. It's warmer, and you're cold. I've slept on floors. On dirt. I can take a chair. Fletcher sighed, running a hand through his hair. Eliza, I ain't about to let a guest sleep sitting up. Not under my roof. Her lips pressed tight. She wanted to argue, but the weight of exhaustion pressed heavier than her pride. Slowly, she nodded. Just the one night. Just the one night, he echoed. He set a pillow and another blanket on the bed in the small room, stepping back as she walked past. Even in his house, she seemed to fill the space, her presence too large for walls that had only known shadows. She paused at the doorway, hand brushing the frame, and looked back at him. For the briefest moment, he saw the fear flicker in her eyes, the fear that when she woke, he might be gone, or worse, that he might be like all the others. But Fletcher only tipped his hat, muttered a rough good night, and settled himself by the fire. He lay awake long after the flames had died to embers, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the quiet shift of the house. He told himself it was only one night, but the whisper of her laugh, the tremor in her voice, the way she had looked when she clutched his coat, those things lingered, unsettling, pulling at something he had buried long ago. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Fletcher rose to the sound of movement in the kitchen. He found her there, hair still damp from the night before, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she worked dough on his counter. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice still rough with sleep. She glanced up, brushing flour from her cheek. "I thought maybe you'd let me earn my keep. Just for the night." Fletcher leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her hands knead the dough with strength that seemed effortless. The sight stirred something unfamiliar in him, a warmth, a memory of what it felt like to wake to more than silence. "You don't owe me anything," he said. Her lips curved, but not in amusement. "The world doesn't work that way, Mr. Ward. Kindness always costs." He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth, carved by too many wounds. The smell of bread filled the room, mingling with the smoke from the morning fire. Fletcher set 2 mugs of coffee on the table. They ate in silence, the crust of the bread crackling as they broke it apart. She ate like someone used to plenty, careful, almost apologetic. After a while, she looked up. "I should go." The words hit harder than they should have. Fletcher set his cup down, staring at her. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to, that she could stay, that maybe the walls of his house were stronger with her inside them. But his throat closed around the words. Instead, he said softly, "Where will you go?" Her eyes dropped. "Does it matter?" Yes, he thought. It matters to me. But he didn't say it. Outside, the sun climbed over the ridge, spilling gold across the land. Somewhere in town, men would be talking, laughing, spreading their small cruelties. And here, in his kitchen, sat the woman they mocked as a mistake. He didn't know it yet, but in that moment, a choice had already been made. Morning broke with the low whistle of wind across the ridge. Fletcher saddled his horse while Eliza stood near the barn, her hair braided back, the sleeves of his spare shirt rolled to her elbows. She looked out of place, and yet not. Her hands, though rough, were steady as she stacked kindling. She moved like someone used to carrying the weight of work, not afraid of dirt, not above the labor that made most women in town wrinkle their noses. Fletcher watched her from the corner of his eye. He told himself it was caution, but it was more than that. He couldn't stop looking at her, at the way she squared her shoulders, at the way she seemed too large for the space she stood in, at the way she tried so hard not to seem like she cared whether he was watching. She caught him staring and raised a brow. "You don't need to keep guard, Mr. Ward. I'm not stealing your cattle." His lips twitched, almost a smile, though it didn't quite reach. "Didn't figure you were. Just not used to company." "You'll forget me soon enough," she muttered. The words struck him harder than they should have. He wanted to ask if she always expected to be forgotten, but the look in her eyes stopped him. They rode into town that afternoon. Fletcher needed feed, and Eliza insisted she could carry her weight by helping. He told her it wasn't necessary. She insisted anyway. When they walked through the dusty street, heads turned. Men paused mid-spit. Women froze with baskets in their hands. Children gawked, pointing at the giant woman beside the rancher who never smiled. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's her. The one they left at the station. Look at the size of her." Eliza's jaw tightened. Her eyes fixed forward, chin high, as though she couldn't hear. But Fletcher saw the way her fists clenched, the way her stride quickened. He felt heat crawl up his neck, shame not for her, but for the town itself. At the feed store, the clerk smirked. "Well, Ward, didn't think you were the type to bring home a circus." Fletcher's hand stilled on the counter. The room went quiet. Eliza's shoulders stiffened, ready for the blow. But Fletcher didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He leaned in close to the clerk, voice low, steady. "She's with me. You got a problem with that?" The smirk faltered. The clerk looked at Fletcher's eyes, saw something there that silenced him, and shoved the ledger forward. No problem. Fletcher grabbed the sack of feed, hefting it to his shoulder as though nothing had happened. But when he stepped outside, he caught the quick glance Eliza gave him. A flicker of something soft. Gratitude, maybe. Or disbelief. They rode home in silence. At the ranch, she slid off the horse, shoulders still tight. She busied herself stacking supplies, her back to him. You don't have to let their words stick, Fletcher said quietly. She froze, then turned, her eyes flashing. You think I don't try? Every town, every man, every glance. I've been laughed out of places before my feet even touched the ground. Words stick whether you want them to or not. Fletcher opened his mouth, then shut it. He had no answer, not one that could heal scars cut that deep. But he stepped closer anyway. Not here. Not with me. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them taut, heavy with all the things neither dared say. Then she looked away, her breath unsteady, and went back to her work. That night, Fletcher found himself lying awake again. The house felt different with her inside it. He heard her shift in the bed, restless. He wondered what memories haunted her dreams. He wondered why he cared so much when he had sworn never to let anyone this close again. And as the fire burned low, Fletcher realized something that unsettled him more than gunfire ever could. He was no longer afraid of her size, or the town's gossip, or even the risk of heartbreak. What terrified him now was how quickly she had filled the silence he thought he needed, and how empty the house would feel again if she walked away. The days stretched into a fragile rhythm. Eliza worked beside Fletcher on the ranch, her strength shocking him at every turn. She hoisted fence posts alone that usually took 2 men. She hauled water from the well with ease, carried feed sacks across the yard as if they weighed nothing. Fletcher tried not to stare, but he couldn't help it. Not just because of her size or her strength, but because of the strange gentleness tucked beneath it. She moved with purpose, but every so often, when she thought no one was watching, her hand would pause to stroke the head of a calf, or her eyes would close as the wind lifted her braid, as though she was storing moments of peace for a time when she would need them again. At night, Fletcher lay awake in his chair by the fire, pretending not to notice when she stirred in the bed behind the half-closed door. Sometimes he heard her weep, muffled and low, like someone trying not to wake the house. He wanted to speak, to tell her she wasn't alone anymore, but the words caught in his throat. He had built walls around his grief for too long. Breaking them down terrified him. One morning, as they saddled the horses, Eliza asked, "Will you take me to the church on Sunday?" The question surprised him. The church. She nodded. "If I'm to stay, even for a little while, I'd rather they see me standing on my own 2 feet than whispering about me in corners." Fletcher studied her. He saw the determination in her jaw, the vulnerability behind her eyes. He knew what the town was like. He knew what they would say, but he also knew what it cost her to ask. "All right," he said finally. "We'll go." Sunday came hot and still, dust clinging to the hems of dresses as families filled the pews. Fletcher walked beside Eliza, his hat low, his shoulders tense. The moment they entered, the church fell silent. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the rows like a wave. "She's here. Look at her. Lord above." Eliza's chin rose higher with every whisper. She followed Fletcher down the aisle, each step heavy but steady. They sat together near the front, the stairs prickling the back of their necks. The preacher faltered over his words when he looked up and saw her, but pushed through, voice cracking slightly as he read from scripture. Afterward, on the church steps, the whispers turned into open words. A group of young men leaned against the rail, smirking. "Careful, Ward," one drawled. "She'll break your back before she breaks your heart." Laughter rippled. Eliza stiffened, her hands curling into fists. Fletcher saw the color rise in her cheeks, the way she fought to swallow her humiliation. Another voice piped up, sharper. "Bet she eats more than your cattle. Lord knows no man could afford to keep a woman like that." Eliza's breath hitched, just barely, but Fletcher heard it. He felt the fire rise in his chest, hotter than he'd felt in years. His boots thundered against the steps as he strode toward the men. "You got something to say," he growled, his voice like stone grinding. "Say it to me." The smirks faltered. The tallest man shifted, glancing at his companions. "Ain't no harm meant, Ward. Just having fun." Fletcher's hand clenched at his side, itching, but he didn't raise it. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low enough that only they could hear. Next time you think of having fun, remember this. She's worth 10 of you. And if I hear her name in your mouths again, you'll answer for it. The men paled, mumbling excuses as they backed away. Eliza stood frozen, her eyes wide, her lips parted. She had expected him to walk away, to leave her standing in the ruins of their mockery like every man before. But instead, he had stood, not just beside her, but before her, carrying the weight of their jeers on his shoulders. On the ride home, she was quiet, staring out at the hills, her hands tied on the reins. Fletcher kept stealing glances, wondering what storm was brewing behind her silence. Finally, as they reached the ridge overlooking his ranch, she spoke. You shouldn't have done that. Fletcher frowned. Done what? Defended me. Now they'll laugh at you too. He pulled his horse to a stop, turning to face her. Let them laugh. They don't live in my skin. They don't carry my heart. I do. Her breath caught. The reins slipped slightly in her hands. She looked at him, really looked, as though seeing him for the first time not as a man who pitted her, but as a man who might choose her. The weight of it shook her. That night, as the firelight danced across the room, Eliza sat at the table while Fletcher mended a bridle. She watched him in silence, the lines of his face etched deep with years of loss and labor. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. Do you know what it's like to be unwanted everywhere you go? Fletcher didn't look up. I know what it's like to bury someone who made me believe I'd never be alone again. Different wound. Same emptiness. Their eyes met then, and something passed between them. Something raw, unspoken, undeniable. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the start of something neither of them could turn away from. The town would laugh. The neighbors would gossip. The world would try to break them. But in that quiet room, with fire crackling and shadows stretching across the walls, Fletcher Ward and Eliza began to believe in something dangerous, something terrifying, something too big to ignore. The storm broke on a Thursday evening. Fletcher and Eliza had just driven the herd back from the south pasture when they heard the shouting. A group of ranch hands from town had ridden out, drunk and mean, circling near the creek. Word had spread faster than wildfire that Fletcher Ward was keeping the giant bride under his roof. And now the men had come to see it for themselves. There she is, one jeered, pointing as Eliza stepped from the barn. Big as a house, Ward. Careful she don't trample your cattle. Laughter ripped through the air. Eliza stiffened, her hands trembling at her sides. Fletcher saw the old wound open in her eyes, the one carved by every jeer she had ever endured. She tried to turn back into the barn, to hide. But Fletcher stepped forward before she could. His boots sank into the dirt, his shadow stretching long in the last of the sun. That's enough. The men snickered. Or what? You'll fight all of us for her. Fletcher's voice cut like steel. I don't have to fight you. You've already shown yourselves smaller than any man here. The laughter faltered. The men shifted, unsure. But one, bolder than the rest, spat into the dirt. She ain't worth the trouble, Ward. Everyone knows she was cast off. Why hang your name on her shame? Fletcher felt the blood roar in his ears. He thought of his wife's grave, of years of silence, of nights staring into firelight with nothing but emptiness to keep him company. And then he looked at Eliza, her shoulders shaking, her chin trembling but still held high. And he knew. Because she's mine, he said, the words steady, unshakable. And I'll stake my land, my name, and my life on it. Now get off my property. The air hung thick. The men glanced at each other, weighing the fire in his eyes, the set of his shoulders. Then, one by one, they turned their horses, muttering as they rode off into the dark. Silence fell heavy. Eliza stood frozen, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. She had expected him to walk away, to let the laughter win as all others had. Instead, he had stood, not just beside her, for her. Her voice cracked when she spoke. Why did you do that? Fletcher turned to her, his chest still heaving. Because I'm done living half a life. And because the only thing too big here, Eliza, is the hole you'd leave if you walked away. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. She pressed her hands to her face, but he stepped forward, pulling them gently aside. He cupped her cheeks in his calloused palms, his thumbs brushing away the wetness. For a long, trembling moment, neither spoke. The night closed in around them, the stars spilling like lanterns across the sky. The barn creaked, the cattle lowed softly, but the world felt still. Finally, Eliza whispered, "They'll never stop laughing." Fletcher's voice was steady, "Sure. Let them laugh. I don't need their courage. I've found mine." And in that quiet, raw moment, the walls between them finally broke. Two souls the world had cast aside stood together, no longer ashamed, no longer afraid. The West had called her a mistake. It had called him a fool. But together, they had found the truth. Love doesn't measure inches. It measures courage. And courage, at last, was theirs. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something deep in your chest, don't just let it end here. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because every week we bring you new tales that are bigger than the West itself. Stories of courage, heartbreak, and second chances that stay with you long after the video fades. When you subscribe, you're not just watching, you're joining a community that believes in love that defies ridicule, hope that rises out of despair, and people who fight to be seen when the world calls them a mistake. Every notification is an invitation to another journey, another story that will move you, surprise you, and remind you that courage always wins in the end. So hit subscribe, tap the bell, and ride with us. Because the next story might just be the one that changes how you see love, loss, and redemption forever.